Okay, we're here for the HSP Discovery Workshop, and I'm going to intro myself just because some people watching this might not really know me from a bar of soap. So I'm just going to let everybody know I'm Jen Turnham, and I use my Bachelor of Psychology degree to help HSP extrovert women thrive and shine their light bright in the world. And it's my mission to also educate the world about how amazing HSP extroverts in particular are, because I think the world, particularly with everything that's going on at the moment, is in dire need of HSPs and our traits. Now we're going to talk about introverts versus extroverts, because this again is an area that it's one of those things where I think everybody thinks they know the difference, but there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding. And I like to try and rectify that. And then the other challenge is when you add HSP to the introvert versus extrovert mix, it muddies the waters when it comes to the extrovert side of things. So I'll touch on that as well. But to start with, I'm just going to talk about the traditional differences between introverts and extroverts in the general population without the HSP trait. So introverts are inward focused. So they focus on their internal thoughts and their internal world. Extroverts, we have an outward focus and we crave sensory stimulation. And the reason for this is brain science research has shown that extroverts are less sensitive to dopamine, which is the reward or a reward chemical in the brain. So that's why we like socializing. That's why we feel that need to do the peopling, as I call it. We need to do some peopling because we need that sensory stimulation. Whereas the inward focused introverts, that overwhelms them because they're so inward focused. And the brain chemical that they crave more of is acetylcholine, whereas we're looking for the dopamine hit. Whereas for introverts, the dopamine hit can be a little bit almost too much, if that makes sense. The other traditional difference between introverts and extroverts is where they get their energy from. So where their battery charger, if you think about us as a mobile phone and we've got to plug in to charge our battery, introverts, they're plugged in all the time. So they don't need an external power source. Their power source is within them and they're plugged in all the time. So if you put them in a socially stimulating or an externally stimulating environment, that's why they get overwhelmed, because they're still plugged into their battery charger and it almost kind of overfills and overloads them. Whereas we need to go to that external environment and go to those social things to plug in our power charger. And that's when we get energy, because we need that sensory stimulation. So that's the traditional difference. And then the other big one is introverts think before they speak because of their internal focus. They think before they speak. And it's not that we speak before we think, because that sounds like not a very good characteristic to have. It's actually that we process things through talking. So that's why we talk things through with people. We have this urge to make a decision via talking, whereas an introvert will do all the thinking, come to the decision, and then speak it. And that's a very big difference between the introverts and the extroverts. And the common misconceptions are introverts are shy, extroverts are loud and arrogant, and they have too much energy. So these are things that are coming up because I obviously put this stuff out there on the internet. The number of times that I've got comments on my quiz, oh, bloody extroverts, I don't like them. They're rude and they're arrogant. And I'm going, no, that's not what it is at all. Most of those sorts of comments I just leave alone. I don't try and re-educate them, but they're the ones that frustrate me. And that's why, because really it is about the brain, the energy source, and thinking versus speaking. They're the main differences between introverts and extroverts. So if you think about us, HSP extroverts, and if you think about the craving for sensory stimulation that extroverts have, but then you think about the O in the does criteria, the overstimulation, it's no wonder that one of the biggest challenges for HSP extroverts is to balance our need for stimulation with getting overstimulated. So it's kind of like we're walking this fine line and we're trying to keep that balance, and it's quite difficult. And quite often we tip one way or the other, and then that's the signal to then go the other way. It's actually quite difficult to just continually have that balance. But if you recognize that that's the seesaw we're kind of on, we need the stimulation, but then we get overstimulated, then you can kind of start to be consciously balancing that seesaw yourself rather than wait for it to go like that and then have to try and fix it. So that's, as I explained, the kind of differences between introverts and extroverts, you probably can start to see why I call HSP extroverts walking contradictions, because some of those introvert characteristics we can relate to because that's our HSP side. And that also kind of makes sense why most HSPs are introverts, because the lists kind of marry up a little bit better than the extrovert list with the HSP list. So walking contradictions is something I like to try and tell people to remember, because then that can help us understand ourselves better and have less frustration when we are doing that kind of seesawing, and just kind of go, okay, well, this is how it is for me because my brain's a little bit unique, and I just need to try and consciously make that seesaw teeter like this rather than like this. So it's a conscious effort. And what I think happens is I believe our sensitivity brings out more typically introverted traits, which is why many HSP extroverts I meet mistakenly think that they're introverts. And I have people say it all the time. They tell me they're ambiverts, which the jury's out on that as to whether there's such a thing as an ambivert. And if you look at the introvert extrovert research, when they're showing the differences in the brain chemicals of introverts and extroverts, it kind of makes sense that there isn't such a thing as an ambivert. So people think they're introverts when they're really HSP extroverts. People tell me they're ambiverts. I go, well, that's not really a thing. And they go, oh, yes, it is. And then we end up in a debate about it. And then I try and explain, you might be feeling, because if you think about introverts, extroverts on a continuum, there's obviously variations of how extroverted you are and how introverted you are. And so ambiverts are probably just closer to the middle, and they think that they're an ambivert, but the brain science would suggest there's no kind of middle ground. But the other thing that might also be happening is we can actually learn to exhibit characteristics of the opposite. So introverts, I know an introvert who, when you meet her, you would think she's an extrovert, but that's because she's learnt to be more extroverted, because Western society rewards the traits of extroversion rather than introversion. So you just think of open plan office. That's an introvert's worst nightmare, whereas they have to learn almost to live in an extrovert world. But it's not that their brain chemistry changes, it's just that they can learn to live and exhibit some characteristics of an extrovert, but their true nature is still always introverts. So there's a couple of different ways that it kind of explains why people think they are perhaps what they're not. And it's particularly confusing for HSP extroverts because the HSP traits kind of, it's almost like, I like to visualize it as the HSP side of us drags us down more towards the middle of the continuum. So we start to then exhibit what seems like more introvert traits. So this is why a lot of us grow up confused or feel like there's something missing, because for me, I knew I was an extrovert from quite a young age. And then when I studied it at university, it confirmed it for me. But then I still felt a bit like, but I don't fit in with the other extroverts. Like there's bits of me. And as I've gotten older, those HSP traits have almost become more pronounced. So I feel even more introverted. And in fact, Dad kept saying to me, oh, you're spending too much time alone, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're an extrovert, you need to get out and have people. And it wasn't until I discovered HSP that I was able to say to Dad, no, that's my HSP side needing that time out and needing that alone time. So that's why it can be quite confusing for us growing up, because even if we know even if we know about extroverts, we still don't quite fit in that box, as we were talking about earlier. People like to put people in boxes, which is not necessarily a good thing, but it's human nature. That's how our brain works. It likes to categorize things. But if we can categorize ourselves, the positive of that is we can understand ourselves better, as we talked about recently. So HSP extroverts, as we start to get that delicate balance between our two sides right, that's when we can appear to be more introverted, because we're respecting our HSP side a lot more, and we're taking that time out. We're spending time alone. We're taking time in between activities to transition, as I call it, that transition time. So it's not that we are more introverted, it's almost like we're respecting our HSP side more than we perhaps were in the past. Because what I think tends to happen as we get older and we learn about this is we learn the price of our overstimulation crashes, so to speak. So we talk about, or we learn that if I keep pushing, this is what's going to happen to me. And I think, Terry, you were talking about that recently at another point, where you realize that, oh, okay, this is why I kind of need to slow down or take a time out, because I can't just keep pushing the way I am. But I think part of us, what causes us to push is because it's almost like we're trying to prove that we are like all the other extroverts. It's like, well, they can do it, why can't I? And it's not until we start to go, well, hang on a minute, let's respect that HSP side of us, that we then can have that balance a little more often. So any questions about the introvert extrovert stuff? Nope, all good, excellent.